All right, guys, so let's get right into this. Now, the purpose of any ketogenic diet, or if you ever hear somebody say they're going keto, the ultimate objective and the ultimate goal with doing the ketogenic diet and going keto is to get your body into the state known as ketosis. Now, we're going to tell you exactly what that is, but before you understand what ketosis is, you need to understand this thing called mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are essentially our cells' battery chargers. You have thousands of these in each one of your cells, and their job is to take the food that you just ate and turn it into fuel for your body to be able to use. Really important that these mitochondria stay healthy. Now, there's really two primary sources that our mitochondria will use. Now, proteins, we'll talk a little bit about that in a later video, in a later module, but for the sake of mitochondria basically use two sources. They use sugar, which would come from your carbs, your fruits, breads, things like that, or they will use fat. Now, fat gets broken down into ketones, sugar gets broken down into glucose. Now, you may have caught that real fast here, that ketones also has keto in it. We'll talk about that. But essentially, when you look at sugar and fat side by side, you're trying to decide what's going to be a better fuel source for your mitochondria. It's like going to the gas station and going, should I do the 87 or should I do the 91? Which one's going to be a better fuel source for your car, for your engine? Now, when we look at this side by side, what's really interesting is we find, based on the science and based on the research, that sugar actually creates more oxidative stress than fat does. Really interesting, because what happens is when sugar gets broken down in mitochondria and mitochondria try to use it as fuel, it actually creates more free radicals. And actually, this oxidative stress, I want you to think of this like rusting in the body. It's basically smog starting to build up in your cells. And when smog builds up in your cells and you start getting this oxidative stress, it creates loads of inflammation and basically creates resistance for your cells to be able to do their job, which is really, really important. But when you look at fat, when fat gets broken down, it turns out that fat's actually a really clean source of fuel. Here's the other thing too, fat actually gives you more energy than sugar does. When you do the breakdown of sugar and fat side by side, it turns out fat will actually give you more energy with less residuals, with less smog, with less oxidative stress. So if we had to choose between one of these two, we want to use fat for fuel. It's a much cleaner fuel source. It's a better fuel source for our body, and we'll talk about all the amazing benefits that happen when we use fat as our main fuel source in the next video. But in particular, this is what ketosis is all about. Ketosis is essentially when your mitochondria and when your metabolism is now running off of fat for fuel rather than sugar, with the ultimate goal being to get the benefits that we'll talk about in the next video. So being in a state of ketosis is basically running off of ketones, which are broken down fat, which is a cleaner source of fuel, gives you more energy as a byproduct, creates less inflammation in the body than sugar is, or glucose. So ultimately, that is what ketosis is. That is going to be our objective for the course, is how do we get to this state where we finally start burning fat as our fuel source. Now, one thing that's important to know, because many people would go, oh, well, why don't I just eat more fat and I should be able to start burning fat right away, right? I'll get into ketosis right away. Here's the problem is our mitochondria and our metabolism has literally created grooves. So you can see my poor drawing here. And most people tend to be stuck on the groove of burning sugar. Thanks to our standard American diet, where we're told we have to eat 50 to 60% of our calories from carbohydrates. Turns out the research doesn't support that. But what happens is people get stuck in the sugar burning mode and they have a hard time actually transitioning their metabolism into fat. And the longer and the deeper that we've made these grooves, the harder it is to transition into this state where we're actually burning fat for fuel. So the goal and the objective is going to be getting us to a point where we can finally get out of this groove and then getting into a state where our body's now able to use fat as a fuel source much easier than ever before. And this is a state that you might have heard of before called being fat adapted, or some would call it keto adapted. And that is our ultimate objective. We want to start creating a new groove where our body is in ketosis. It starts burning fat for fuel rather than sugar and gets us into a state where we are now fat adapted. And that's where you're going to experience all the major benefits that come with ketosis that we'll talk about in the next video.